The struggling streets of New Singapore. The undercity of New Singapore was a strange and volatile blend of vibrant energy and oppressive darkness. Neon signs flashed across the grimy streets, casting artificial colors that fought against the heavy shadows of the overhanging, dilapidated buildings. The hum of power lines, mixed with the chatter of diverse species speaking in languages both familiar and foreign, filled the air with an incessant buzz. It was a world constantly in motion, yet somehow it felt stuck in a perpetual state of decay. John Kerr, clad in his high-tech EGIS-class combat suit, walked purposefully through the crowd. His environmental systems hummed softly, adjusting the temperature inside his helmet and providing him with constant feedback. The green status indicators pulsed rhythmically across the dark titanium plating, a reminder of the suit's advanced capabilities, while the filtered air blocked out the overpowering stench of wet concrete, alien food vendors, and the occasional waft of something far more unpleasant. John wasn't here for leisure. He was in the immigrant district, a notorious section of the Undercity, where refugees from across the galaxy lived in squalor, struggling to survive. New Singapore, despite its futuristic exterior and cutting-edge technology, was a city built on contradictions. Its towering, pristine skyscrapers above hid a festering wound below. The Undercity was the heart of those who had been forgotten, the abandoned, and the downtrodden, and John had seen more than his fair share of misery on these streets. His mission today was simple: check in with a few local informants about some smuggling operations, take a quick detour to the CDF headquarters in 2 hours, and keep an eye on any potential threats. He had no interest in getting caught up in the poverty or the struggles that these people faced. His job was to be detached, to observe and act when necessary, but never to get too involved. As he passed by a crumbling wall, his eyes caught an unexpected sight: a lone figure huddled in the shadow of a building. A female foodie Callan, one of the newer species to join the Galactic Commonwealth, was crouched on the cold pavement. She was thin, her once vibrant blue skin dulled with dirt, barely covered by ragged clothing that had seen better days. Her head was bald, glistening with raindrops that trickled down her scalp. She moved in a way that was strange to him, careful, almost desperate. It wasn't just her apparent destitution that caught his attention, but the way she hunched over a discarded food container, scraping the last remnants from it with her hands, as if the food was the most precious thing in the world. John stopped in his tracks. His eyes narrowed behind his helmet, and he instinctively adjusted the environmental settings on his suit to filter out the smell of the stagnant water and the wet concrete around him. He had seen more than enough poverty in the last decade to know that this wasn't unusual. There were refugees everywhere, trying to make do, forced to survive in a city that could care less about their existence. But something about this particular sight stuck with him. The foodie Callan, despite her apparent hunger and weariness, maintained a strange dignity. She didn't look around furtively like others did, trying to hide their shame. She was focused, intent on what she was doing, as though there was no other choice but to take what she could from this grim environment. John hesitated, watching her for a few moments as she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The other pedestrians in the area seemed to avoid her gaze, their eyes darting away, not wanting to make contact. It was as if she was invisible to them. But not to John. He couldn't look away. He had been trained to see threats, to notice danger in the crowded streets, but here, in this quiet, miserable corner of New Singapore, all he could see was a woman. An alien, desperate to survive in a world that had forgotten her kind. It was then that he noticed the faint flicker of a smile on her lips as she finally retrieved the last scraps from the ground. He felt a pang of something, a feeling he couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity. It was more like an understanding of something he had long since buried in himself, an acknowledgement that this alien woman, though far from home, was just like him, struggling, fighting to survive. John's boots clicked against the wet pavement as he moved closer. He didn't think about it. He just acted. Reaching into the storage compartment of his suit, he pulled out a synth cola. the familiar product, a small gesture of kindness in this cold world. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something better than nothing. "Here," he called out as he tossed the can toward her. Without looking up, the foodie Callan's hand shot out with an unexpected grace. She caught the can midair, her fingers gripping it tightly as if it was a lifeline. She studied the can for a moment before inspecting the tab. With a practiced motion, she popped the tab and began gulping down the drink in a way that reminded John of a dehydrated animal, desperate to consume whatever was available. "Easy there," John chuckled, stepping closer but still maintaining a respectable distance. "There's plenty more where that came from." The alien woman lowered the can and looked at him with a mixture of weariness and quiet hope in her large iridescent eyes. Her gaze was intense, scanning him like she was trying to determine if this stranger meant any harm. "Why?" Her voice was melodic, though rough, as though she hadn't spoken to anyone in days. It was a simple question, but it carried the weight of someone who had long ago learned not to expect help or anything from anyone. "Because I can," John replied with a shrug. "I'm John. What's your name?" "Tia," she answered hesitantly, clutching the now empty can like it was a treasure. "Just Tia." John raised an eyebrow at her response. He noticed how she clutched the can to her chest protectively, as if it was the most important thing she owned. "Well, Tia, how about something with real calories?" he said, pulling out a chocolate bar from his suit and offering it to her. Tia grabbed the bar quickly, but instead of eating it immediately, she studied the rectangular piece of chocolate with wide eyes. She seemed to hesitate, trying to understand it, perhaps thinking there was more to it than just food. "What is it?" she asked, her voice full of genuine curiosity. "Earth chocolate," John replied with a grin. "Try it." Tichia's first bite was tentative. She chewed slowly, as if unsure what to expect. But as she took the second bite, her expression softened. Her eyes widened in pleasure as she devoured the rest of the chocolate bar with increasing urgency, as if she had never tasted something so delicious. But then, to John's surprise, she hunched over and began eating the chocolate that had fallen onto the dirty ground. Bits of it lay scattered between them, smeared with mud and grime, but she didn't care. She was eating it anyway, as if it was the only thing that mattered. John's smile faded. "Whoa, hold up," he said, kneeling down beside her. "You don't have to eat off the ground. That's not." But Tikia interrupted him, her voice steady, without a hint of self-pity. "It is what I know. What I've always known." John's heart sank. This wasn't just about food. This was about survival. This was about a woman who had been reduced to scraping by, living like this for far too long. "How long have you been here?" John asked, his voice quieter now. 3 Earth years, Tia replied, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Since the evacuation of Futicala Prime, no one will hire a refugee without credentials, especially not one who..." She gestured to herself. "Who lives like this?" John stood up, his suit's sensors automatically highlighting potential threats in the growing crowd. He saw curious onlookers, but there were also a few who seemed hostile, their eyes narrowed in judgment. He ignored them. They didn't matter. "Come with me," John said, extending his hand to her. "Let me get you some real food." Tichia stared at his hand, uncertain, almost fearful. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Because I can," John said firmly, his tone carrying a hint of warmth. "Because it's right, and because no sentient being should have to eat off the ground. Besides, I know this great burger joint around the corner. Best fusion cuisine in the Undercity. They make these amazing spice blend fries that'll knock your socks off." Dia blinked, looking up at him with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "You are strange for a human." John chuckled. "I'll take that as a compliment." After a brief hesitation, Tia slowly took his hand, and together they began walking toward the restaurant. The Undercity was dangerous, filled with judgment and hostility, but for the first time in a long while, John felt as if he was doing the right thing. As they walked together, side by side, he realized that one small gesture could change everything. The invitation to something more. The journey from the alley to Big Al's intergalactic grill was short, but it was far from uneventful. Every step seemed to bring more tension to Tita's shoulders. John couldn't help but notice how she shrank into herself, how her eyes darted from side to side, avoiding the gazes of those around them. Despite the small comfort of the food John had given her, she was still very much a product of her environment. Her posture tense, as if she expected the worst at any moment. The undercity of New Singapore had a way of chewing up those who couldn't defend themselves, and Tia, it seemed, had learned how to keep her head down in order to survive. John had seen it before. There was a silent language of shame here, an unspoken understanding that those who were down didn't deserve to be looked at, let alone helped. They passed a group of young aliens, their eyes narrowing as they watched Tia. Whispers spread like wildfire, and one of them muttered something under their breath. John clenched his jaw, his gloved hands tightening slightly at his sides. He'd spent enough time in the Undercity to know that these weren't the kinds of people who would extend a hand to someone like Tia. He was no stranger to prejudice, human or otherwise, but the casual cruelty displayed by some of the pedestrians rubbed him the wrong way. Tia, however, kept her head down, her eyes trained on the cracked pavement beneath her feet, her hands clutching John's more firmly as though it was her only anchor in this hostile world. It struck John as both heartbreaking and inspiring. This woman, this alien refugee, was living with a strength that he didn't think most humans would have in her shoes. But she wasn't alone anymore. And for that, John was determined to make sure she didn't feel like an outcast. As they rounded the corner, Big Al's intergalactic grill came into view, its neon sign flashing brightly against the darkness. The exterior of the restaurant was a mishmash of styles, Earth's retro diners mixed with alien aesthetic touches. The chrome fixtures, the neon lights, and the bioluminescent decorations created an odd but welcoming atmosphere. It was a stark contrast to the dim and grim surroundings, offering a glimmer of hope in an otherwise drab world. John smiled as they approached. "Here we are, Big Al's. You'll like it," he said, glancing over at Tia. Tichia's gaze flickered up at the sign, and for a moment, John saw something shift in her expression, a flicker of curiosity, something he hadn't seen before. It was a small change, but it was enough to tell him that this wasn't just a random meal to her. This was a moment when she could step away from the grinding poverty that had held her down for years, a moment when she could taste something more than the dirt-covered scraps of discarded food. As they walked inside, the atmosphere changed immediately. The air inside was warm and filled with the sounds of sizzling grills and distant chatter. A Martian host, his 4 eyes blinking in alarm when he saw Tia, straightened up from behind the counter. His expression was one of surprise and discomfort. "Sir, I must protest," he began, clearly not accustomed to seeing a foodie Callan in the restaurant. The species had a reputation in the galaxy. Many felt that they were too new to the Commonwealth, too foreign to fit in with the more established races. They were refugees, outsiders, struggling to find their place. The fact that Tia was with a human and not hiding her identity made the Martian uncomfortable. John, however, wasn't having it. He cut the host off with a firm tone. "Save it," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to command. "2 for dinner, private booth." He turned to Tia and gave her a warm, reassuring smile. "Trust me, you're going to love the food here. They've got these fusion fries that are out of this world." Tia hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the room as though she expected everyone to turn and stare at her. But the host, realizing that there was no arguing with John, gestured toward an empty booth. As they made their way to the back of the restaurant, the murmur of voices seemed to lower slightly, the stares from the other patrons more apparent. John noticed that some of the other diners were whispering to each other, casting sideways glances at Tia. He could feel the tension in the air, the discomfort that followed them like a shadow, but he didn't let it affect him. He pulled out the chair for Tia, helping her settle into the booth before sitting across from her. The restaurant, though filled with an eclectic mix of beings from all over the galaxy, seemed to settle into a slightly more natural rhythm as John and Tia sat down. "Here," John said, pulling out a menu and sliding it toward Tia. "Take your pick. You'll like the options. Earth fusion, with a twist." Tia looked at the menu, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar words, the unfamiliar dishes. "What's Earth fusion?" she asked, a slight frown crossing her face. John chuckled. "It's a combination of Earth's classic comfort food with flavors and techniques from all over the galaxy. You've probably never tasted anything like it." She studied the menu for a few more moments, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar symbols. "I've never had a choice before," Tia murmured, her voice soft. "Food has always been survival." She met John's eyes, her gaze both grateful and vulnerable. "I don't know what to choose." John smiled warmly. "That's okay. We'll start small. Get something simple, and we'll go from there." Just as their waiter arrived to take their order, a hush seemed to settle over the nearby table. The odd glances and whispers had quieted, but John could still feel the subtle discomfort hanging in the air. He couldn't help but think of how unfair it was. How many times in his life had he walked into places without a second glance, without fear of judgment or rejection? How many people like Tia had walked through those same doors, only to feel the weight of being looked down upon because of something they couldn't control? As their waiter took their order, John turned his attention back to Tia. She was still scanning the menu, her eyes softer now, not filled with desperation, but something more hopeful, something that, until this moment, hadn't seemed to be a part of her world. The food arrived shortly after, and as they dug into the fusion fries, John noticed the slight change in Tia's demeanor. Her shoulders had relaxed, the tightness in her expression softening with each bite. Her eyes sparkled with something he had never expected to see in her, a sense of wonder, as if this simple meal was opening up a door to a world she had forgotten existed. "Good?" John asked, leaning back in his chair and watching her closely. Tia's response was a small smile, the first real smile she had given him since they met. "Good," she said quietly. "It's more than I expected." For a brief moment, the world outside the restaurant seemed far away. The harsh reality of the Undercity, the judgment from the crowds, they didn't matter in this moment. Here, at this table, in this small booth, Tia wasn't a refugee or an outcast. She was just a person, sharing a meal with someone who cared enough to notice her. And for the first time, it seemed like she was starting to believe that she might be more than just a survivor. She might have a place in this world after all. The hidden struggles. The meal at Big Al's Intergalactic Grill passed in a haze of strange yet comforting flavors. Tia, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, had found a moment of peace. As she ate, her eyes brightened with wonder, as if she were discovering a new world with every bite. John, on the other hand, couldn't help but notice the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the way her shoulders slowly relaxed, the tension in her jaw easing, the flicker of hope returning to her eyes. He had seen so many people in his line of work, some stronger than others, but Tia's quiet resilience stood out. As they finished their meal, John leaned back in the booth, surveying the restaurant's lively atmosphere. The hum of conversation, the clinking of cutlery, and the soft jazz playing in the background made it feel like a world away from the gritty Undercity streets. For a moment, he felt like they were part of something larger, something that wasn't defined by their circumstances, but by the simple act of sharing food and conversation. "So," John said, breaking the comfortable silence between them, "what do you think?" Tia looked up from her plate, her eyes still wide from the newness of the experience. I've never tasted anything like this. It's like a dream." She smiled faintly, almost as though she couldn't believe the words she was saying. "I never thought I would have a meal like this. Ever." John smiled, though there was a pang in his chest. "Well, I'm glad you liked it. You deserve to enjoy good food, not just scrape by. He leaned forward, his voice softer. You deserve more than what this city has to offer. At his words, Titia's expression faltered slightly. For the first time since they'd sat down, her guard seemed to return, a shadow crossing over her face. She placed her fork down gently, her eyes not meeting his. It's not that simple, she said, her voice low and hesitant. This place, this city, it's not built for people like me. People like us. She gestured to herself, then to John, as though encompassing more than just the two of them. It's built for people who have something to give. I'm just a refugee. And no one here wants to give anything to someone like me. John frowned, hearing the deep pain in her voice. He knew that look, that sense of defeat. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had returned from the front lines broken and scarred. He had seen it in the eyes of civilians whose homes had been destroyed by the endless cycles of war. But this was different. This wasn't a loss of hope after fighting a battle. This was a loss of hope after simply existing in a world that couldn't care less. You're wrong, John said firmly, leaning across the table. You have value. You have something to give, even if you can't see it right now. And I'm not just talking about this food. He paused, allowing his words to settle. No one should be made to feel invisible, Tia. Not here. Not anywhere. Titia's eyes met his, and for a moment, there was something vulnerable in her gaze. It was fleeting, like a crack in a wall that had been carefully constructed over years. But it was enough for John to see the truth. She didn't believe him. She didn't believe she had any worth beyond the scraps she could scrape together. I used to believe that, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, back when we still had a home. When Futicala Prime wasn't just a memory. But it's been so long now, John. 3 years of nothing. 3 years of rejection and hardship. And now I don't know how to believe in anything anymore. John sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He had no easy answers for her. He couldn't just wave away the years of pain and suffering she had endured. He couldn't erase the bitterness of being forced into refugee status, of being abandoned by the very system she had once been part of. What she had been through was more than he could imagine, more than his world had ever prepared him for. But one thing he knew for certain was that he couldn't let her walk out of this restaurant feeling the same way she had when she entered. Then let me help you find it again, he said quietly, his voice steady. Let me show you that there's more than just survival in this world. You don't have to live in fear of being forgotten. I'll be here, Tia. And I won't forget you. Titia's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Instead, she looked away, staring out the window at the bustling city streets, her fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the table. The silence between them stretched out, but this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that existed when two people shared the weight of unspoken thoughts. Eventually, Dihia broke the silence. Her voice was low, almost tentative. Why are you doing this for me, John? You don't owe me anything. You didn't have to stop and give me food. You didn't have to take me here. John looked at her, his gaze steady. I don't owe you anything. You're right. But I don't need an excuse to help someone. I don't need a reason to do what's right. He paused, his tone softening. And I don't want you to think that you're alone in this. You're not the only one who's been forgotten. Titia looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something, perhaps for sincerity, or perhaps for a glimmer of truth. For a long moment, the two of them locked eyes, and in that silent exchange, John saw something shift in her. It was small, but it was there. A flicker of trust, of belief that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Thank you, she whispered, almost as though she were unsure of whether she deserved the gratitude. Thank you for seeing me. John smiled gently, though there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. You don't need to thank me. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to have a chance. The waiter returned, and the two of them finished the meal in quiet contemplation. The noise of the restaurant, now filled with the chatter of patrons and the clinking of silverware, seemed like a distant echo to John. His thoughts kept circling back to Tia, to her quiet strength, and to the unbearable weight of the loneliness she had been carrying. She had been abandoned by everyone, yet here she was, still holding onto something. The tiniest spark of hope, despite everything. They left the restaurant, and as they stepped back into the Undercity, John could see the change in Tia. She was walking a little straighter now, her steps a little less tentative. The judgmental glances from pedestrians still followed her, but she didn't shrink away from them as she had earlier. There was something different in her now, something John hadn't seen before. She wasn't just surviving. She was starting to live again. John glanced over at her, feeling a small sense of accomplishment. It wasn't much, he knew, but it was a start. And sometimes that was all you needed. A start. A chance. The streets of New Singapore's Undercity were as busy as ever, but for the first time that evening, it felt like Tia was no longer invisible. And neither was John. They were two people, walking together through a world that had nearly forgotten both of them, but not anymore.